everybody. My name's Liz Weaver, and welcome to our webinar today. We're doing a collective impact capacity building webinar series, and our first in the series is building community capacity for collective impact. And so I'm really happy to have you all join us today. We want to begin by acknowledging our gratitude to Indigenous peoples. So we begin this workshop by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of our land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. And so I'm located in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And so my office is located on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. And we invite you, if you know the traditional lands on which you're joining us today, to put that into the chat box. In Canada, we are in a truth and reconciliation process with our Indigenous peoples. And so land acknowledgement is a foundational part of our commitment to the truth and reconciliation process. And I can see some of you are posting your lands in the chat box as well. I would like to begin this session by thanking the series sponsors. So our series sponsors, you can see on the screen today. I have been working with Leslie Little from Nurture to really put together this series. And I know that she's been working with a number of other sponsors. So Leslie, if you're on the call today, would you like to say a few words? You just have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you. So I want to, first of all, thank our major sponsor, Virginia Foundation for Healthy Youth, who has made possible some funding so that we can support this webinar, and our partner in this, Cinch, or with their new name, 757 Breastfeeds in the Hampton Roads area. So just a little background on this. We both have collective impact embedded in the current grants that we're working on. And neither of us, by working together and joining forces, we were able to present this to both of our communities. And so we're really excited to be able to work together, even though we're apart, which seems to be the theme of COVID-19. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Leslie. And thanks to all the sponsors for bringing this series together. And as you know, it's one of a 4-part series. This is our first webinar. And then over the course of the next month, we're going to be hosting 2 other webinars. And then the final wrap-up webinar is happening in May. You can sign up individually for each of the webinars or for the whole series. And so or for the whole rest of the series. So if you haven't necessarily signed up, we will be sending you in the post email a link where you can sign up for the future sessions. Today, we're going to focus on building capacity for collective impact, and then we're going to talk about how do you unfold collective impact in the first year. We know some of you are already using the framework, but it's still good to kind of think about what does that first year look like, and what are the things that you maybe didn't include in your startup work of collective impact that would be good to bring into your current work. The third webinar, we're going to look at how data is so critical to successful collective impact efforts. And then finally, we're going to focus on sustaining collective impact collaborative work. And so that's this series. This is me. I'm the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute. I also at the Tamarack Institute lead the Tamarack Learning Center, and I spend quite a bit of time working with groups who are trying to pursue or deepen their collective impact experience. So if we go to the next slide. So this tells you a little bit about the organization that I work for. So Tamarack has two core parts to our work. The first part is the part that I sit in right now, which is the Tamarack Learning Center. And at the Tamarack Learning Center, we really focus on 5 interconnected practices for community change makers. And we know that all of you on the call, in your own way and in the work that you do, are really working at the level of community change. And so we at Tamarack look at how the field is evolving. We develop tools, resources, webinars, workshops, and we really try intentionally to advance the field. At Tamarack, we also have an initiative called Vibrant Communities. And in Vibrant Communities, we support cities and local leaders to implement large scale change. And we have 3 areas of focus currently in our Vibrant Communities portfolio. We have about 300 communities in Canada and the United States that are actively working at cross sector roundtables to reduce poverty. We have a number of communities that are working at addressing social isolation and loneliness, and we call that deepening community. And then we just recently launched Communities Building Youth Futures, which really is an opportunity to support young people in the transition through high school graduation into post-secondary education, training, and employment. So that's the work at Tamarack. This is what we're going to do together in the next hour. Is we're going to spend some time learning a little bit about what we're going to do today. That's the introduction part that we've done already. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on content and presentation, and we're going to invite you at a number of points in the session to put things into the chat box. So we want to make the chat box kind of our more interactive space on this webinar. So please do jump in, jump online, share resources, answer questions in the chat box. We'd really love to hear from you. And then there's an opportunity for questions and answers. And there is a Q&A element on Zoom. And so put your questions into the Q&A area, and we will, at the end of the webinar, we'll pull out some of those questions and answer those questions. So our first interactive activity is to do a little bit of a check-in with you. And so here are 6 ways that you might be feeling today. So are you feeling all kind of caught up and tight in a ball and a little bit messy? Are you feeling like a butterfly emerging a chrysalis, right? Have you recently gotten your COVID shot and you're just ready to reconnect face to face with people in your community? Are you, at the top end in the red zone of a pressure cooker? Do you feel like you're leaping between a big divide? Are you like what's happening in Iceland, this kind of exploding volcano, and pressure is building and building and you're exploding? Or is it like you're splashing a lot of splashes and you're seeing the ripple effects happen in all these splashes? So Duncan has a poll for us, and he's going to ask you to vote where you are on this poll. I know we'd put it in the chat box, but Duncan is very innovative and he said, let's put a poll together. So why don't you check on the poll and figure out where you are? And then Duncan, once we have the majority of people who have voted, let's see where our group is.
Yeah, we'll just give it a few more moments. We're already at 70%, which is great. I really struggle with this one because I feel like I'm in between a few of them. But the number 4, the leap of faith, I think really resonates just because it's such a period of just trying new things, regardless of whether or not you want to sometimes, just because of the context.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think for me, it's hour by hour in a day. Sometimes I feel like I'm having this leap of faith, and other times I just feel like it's a volcano and lots of pressure, and I'm just about to explode, right? So today I think I'm with you more in the leap of faith category. Hey, oh my goodness, we have quite a mix of responses here. So, I think the number 1 response is the jumbled jam, but there are some that are quickly following along, like the butterfly metamorphosis and the splash and ripple effect. So interesting, eh? So it's interesting to see how our virtual room is sitting right now. Thanks everybody for sharing your responses with us. Let's go on to the next slide. So our goals today are to really think about collective impact and think about it intentionally. So we're going to talk about the preconditions of collective impact, which are around community readiness. Then we're going to focus in on the preconditions. We're going to look at the basics around the framework. And we've got a couple of examples at the end of the presentation around collective impact in action. And in the middle of the presentation, we're going to talk about the mindset shifts. So this is about working differently, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to work differently. So those are the core things we're going to cover today. And we're going to start now with this kind of, is your community and network ready for collective impact? And as Leslie said, some of you are already working in this with this mindset and with this intentionality. So you might already be quite far along this continuum, but it's important to always reflect back on, what are the elements of readiness that we have to pay attention to? So we're going to start with the first one, which is really community readiness. And this comes from the work of Rich Harwood. And Rich Harwood says that, each community is in a different kind of state of readiness. And while this shows, going right through to sustain and renew, in fact, it's not as linear as this. This is just kind of a design. But it's interesting. The first stage of readiness, Rich refers to as a waiting place, that there are people in the community who know that there is a problem, but they're waiting for that knight in shining armor, or that knightess in shining armor to show up, right? And so, they know it's a problem, but they think someone else will come in this with the solution. And this is often when we look to government for solutions, right? We're not owning the problem ourselves. The second state of readiness that Harwood talks about is that there is an impasse in the community. So they know that there's a problem, but they're doing this, oh, it's Leslie's problem, or it's Liz's problem, or it's this organization's problem, not necessarily my organization's problem. And what's interesting about collective impact work is that you can work with communities that are at an impasse. It's just bringing the right players around the table and really trying to say, okay, so how do we all both contribute to this problem, but also can contribute to the solution? The next stage of readiness is catalytic, and that's really the sweet spot in Harwood's model. Catalytic means that, the community knows there's a problem. There are different layers of leadership in the community that are willing to step up to the plate, and these leaders are connected together. And so there's the ability to catalyze momentum in a community. The fourth area of readiness is growth. And sometimes a community that has a lot going on, a growth community, is not necessarily the sweet spot for collective impact. A growth community is often a place where there are multiple collective impact or multiple collaborative things going on in the community at the same time. And you kind of do the collaborative shuffle, right? So people go from one collaborative planning table to another collaborative planning table to another collaborative planning table. And because there's so much going on, there's sometimes not the space for newness to open up. So growth can be a place that you see collective impact, but you've really got to pay attention. How much else is going on in my community? And then the final readiness factor is sustaining or renewing. And sometimes when you're sustaining a collective impact initiative, you might not go all the way back to waiting place, but you might, or you might just jump back to catalytic and then do another round. So it's really interesting to consider these 5 phases. So if we go to the next slide, we have a bit of a question for you here. And this is where we're going to ask you to actually enter into the chat box. Where do you think your community is right now on the readiness scale? So we know that many of you are joining us from all different parts in Virginia. So where do you think your community is right now? If we were to seed a collective impact initiative in your community, where do you think it is? So Leslie has put in catalytic. Duncan, are there others that are coming forward?
Yeah, it seems like a pretty diverse group. We have lots of growth, waiting, catalytic, um, not a lot of impasse or sustaining or renewing. And I wonder if that's typical, if those three tend to be the places where people get either caught up in a loop, or maybe those are the stages that take the longest. Is that the case?
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because people who would join a webinar on collective impact are probably interested in collective impact and interested in seeding it, right? So they probably are thinking about and probably have had some of those conversations around, what do you think? Should we be doing it? Should we be working in this way? So yeah, I'm not surprised about catalytic and growth, and it's interesting those who show up in waiting or renewal. And so I think, maybe what we can do in the post email is send out the documents from Harwood around these stages of readiness. He has a bit of an assessment tool that you can use, and I think it's a great way of kind of doing a little bit of diagnosis up front before you make the big investment in collective impact work. And so that's why we often refer to it as a precondition. So thanks everybody for that. If we go back to the slide, back one slide, we're going to talk about the complexity of the issue. So we know community readiness is something to pay attention to. We also think that community context is something to pay attention to. So what are people talking about in the community? How do we listen to that intently? Where can we find that information? And then the third issue is really around complexity of the issue. And so on the next slide, what we get to see are that different types of problems require different kinds of solutions. And this comes from some work called the Cynefin framework. And the Cynefin framework says, there are simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic problems that we face in our communities. And simple problems are ones like, so I listened to a video yesterday and he said it was about making coffee, right? So basically, to make coffee, you follow a basic recipe, you have the right machinery, and you're going to get a good cup of coffee, right? You follow best practice. It's a pretty obvious kind of thing that you do. So you wouldn't necessarily, well, you wouldn't do collective impact when you're trying to solve simple problems. You're just going to follow the best practice recipe. In a complicated or rugged landscape, it's really looking at good practice. It's looking at what you know about the problems, and it's bringing expert judgment to the forefront. So an example of a complicated problem is something like sending a rocket to the moon, right? That's a really good example of a complicated problem because you need the experts around the table to figure out all the technology in order to send that rocket successfully to the moon and have it return, right? Complex problem is really the sweet spot for collective impact, right? So in a complex problem, a really good example of a complex problem is raising a child. And if you have multiple children in your family, you know that, the interventions you might have for one child is not necessarily the same set of interventions that you're going to have for the second child, because that second child has things that are different about their lives. They have their personality, they may have a different friend group. You as a parent have changed the way that you parent. You have more expertise around being a parent. So it's really interesting. And so in a complex problem, what we do is we often act, we react, and we adapt, right? And so this is kind of probe, sense, and respond. And so collective impact really is in the sweet spot of complex problems, right? Where we think about what's going on in our community, we consider whether collective impact is the right frame for that. And then as we're rolling out our collective impact effort, it's really kind of like acting, reacting, and adapting as we go. And then the final framework or the kind of problem that we face is this chaotic problem. And a really good example of the chaotic problem, and you can see it on this picture is like a tornado or some kind of environmental disaster. And so in an environmental disaster, you actually don't want to say, oh, what's happening? You actually need really quick action. So in that case, it's act first and then look at, kind of what has stabilized the community and where did innovation emerge. And so it is, each of these kinds of approaches to problems requires different ways of adapting ourselves to the nature of the problem, but also how we might respond to the problem. So collective impact is really in this dancing landscape. It's navigating the wave, right? Surfing well. So let's go on to the next slide. So once we've kind of identified, Leslie's asking, could COVID be an example of a turbulent landscape? Absolutely, COVID is a more turbulent landscape because we're continually having to adapt our way through it. And we often will see in our COVID responses, that not everybody in the community is receives the same benefits at the same time, right? So we're seeing much more through our shared COVID experience that the benefits are they're not they're not accessible to everybody, or the impacts of COVID have a deeper weight for certain types of communities, certain ethnicities, there's a big equity question that is emerging out of the COVID reality. So these are things that we would consider to be the readiness factors or the preconditions of collective impact. And again, it's community readiness, community context, complexity of the issue. And then you ask the question, hey, is collective impact the right way for us to organize ourselves? Okay, now we're going to tell you a little bit about collective impact. And those of you that work in this frame probably already know this, but it's good to always remind ourselves. So collective impact, the thing about this, is a framework that was released in the Stanford Social Innovation Review in an article called Collective Impact. And it was actually developed by John Kenya and Mark Kramer from FSG Social Consultants. And what they did was they were looking at large scale change, and they were starting to try to codify what it takes to get to large scale change. And that's essentially the background behind the framework. So they call it a disciplined cross-sector approach. And the framework has two elements to it, or two parts to it. The first part is these preconditions, right? So the preconditions in collective impact work are influential champions. So who are the people, if you're trying to solve this complex problem in your community, who are the people that you need to have around the table? And at Tamarack, we talk about influential champions from the perspective of both content experts, people who know a lot about that issue, they're experts in that issue, and then context experts. And so if you think about, the work of Nurture, RVA, and others, you would have your content experts, people who are running the organizations, and then you might have, the moms in the community, those that are pregnant currently, those that are newly minted moms, and those that might be a little bit further along in their mom journey, and also their family members. They would be context experts because they would bring lived or living experience to the issue. They would be able to tell you what's working well for them, or what worked well for them, and what's not working well for them. And it's the balance of these influential champions, the content and the context, that really helps you dive into the complexity of the problem, and also helps you understand what the potential solutions might be. The second precondition is urgency. So you might, as a content expert, really think this is so important and urgent in your community as an issue, but nobody else cares about it, right? And so urgency leads you in collective impact work to move your work forward faster. So you need to build this kind of sense of urgency around it. And so urgency can be found through data. It can be found through, is this on the hearts and minds of people in the community? Is it, are articles being written about it? Are certain segments of the population, the healthcare sector, or certain population segments, are they seeing the urgency, or was there a critical situation in your community that raised up the level of urgency? And we often see this with networks, collective impact networks that are trying to advance a suicide prevention program. They might have had a number of suicides in the community, and that then creates a sense of urgency. So urgency is really critical to collective impact. And then finally, the final condition is adequate human and financial resources. So we know that collective impact takes resources. And so do you have enough resources to work over a longer term horizon, right? 3 to 5 years for collective impact work. So, Duncan, if we go to the next slide, it's really a question again that we want you to put into the chat box. Which of these preconditions is most challenging to you and the work that you're doing around collective impact? Is it getting the influential champions to the table? Is it urgency, creating this sense of urgency, or is it, like Kristen says, financial resources is the challenging one to bring forward? We love to hear from you.
Yeah,
So
Liz,
Duncan.
I wonder, I am seeing quite a few mentions of financial resources. And before those started coming in, I wondered if that would be kind of disproportionately more represented in a COVID context, just because of the financial difficulties. If right now, maybe that's a bit higher than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, in some cases it would be, but in other cases, there's revenue that is going into communities to help them build capacity, right? And it's interesting because it isn't, it's a theme I see a lot when I do presentations about collective impact. And what I always think about is, communities have a lot of resources. What we're often doing is we're not joining our resources up together, right? And so collective impact is about thinking about how might we do that more intentionally, right? How might we have resources in this organization, just as Leslie did when she was thinking of putting this webinar series together, joining up resources from a variety of different funding partners to make this go from an idea that she and I were talking about to something that is a reality, right? So it is really thinking in a collective impact context, what's already coming into our community that's addressing this issue, and then how do we start to join those resources up together more intentionally? So I
Yeah,
can
I
see
think
a number of other things have popped up.
Yeah, I think that really resonates. We do see quite a few finances that seems to be something that comes up again and again. We had a few people share all of them, which I think also resonates a little bit. But I think one other theme that comes through is the influential champions bit, especially in getting the people you need to be at the table to view the issue as urgent.
So I think, the person who said all of them is a very wise person, because I would lean in that direction as well. Influential champions, if you have the right ones, can leverage resources for you, right? Urgency also can be a lever for resources. So it is kind of interesting to think about the interconnectedness of these preconditions. What we often see in collective impact work is that people jump over the preconditions to get to the core conditions, and you do so at your peril, right? Really kind of thinking about these preconditions and using them almost as a checkbox is really an important thing to kind of consider. So let's go on to the slide about the conditions of collective impact, because this is where, this is the meat of the framework, right? So there are 5 kind of core conditions in collective impact. The development of kind of a shared or common agenda for change. So what is it that we all agree to that we're going to work on together? And what's really important in terms of developing a common agenda, and we'll see this when we get to the session where we focus on data and shared measurement, is data needs to inform your common agenda, right? So even though it appears as a separate condition, you need to know, how many people in our community are impacted by this issue. And the the more you can say, hey, there are 3,900 pregnant women in our community right now, and the pregnancy and birth rate is a kind of a stable rate over time. So we know annually that's roughly what we're going to work with. That actually helps you frame, the core elements of your common agenda. The second condition is shared measurement. So it's data to inform the development of the common agenda, but it's also what are we going to measure over time. The third condition of collective impact is the one I like the best, but it's the one we don't understand, right? And this is really about mutually reinforcing activities. And this is thinking about, okay, so I know that Leslie's group is doing this, my group is doing that. How can we come together? How can we lever the work that her group is doing over here and my group is doing over here to achieve the change, that common agenda, achieve progress on the common agenda? So the top three conditions are the what of collective impact. The bottom two are some of the how, right? So the how is if you bring lots of people together to work on a collective impact kind of table, you got to continuously communicate with them, but you also have to communicate with influential champions in the community and with the community at large, because that creates urgency, that brings the champions to the table, that can lever resources being released. So continuous communications is really critical. And then collective impact. What's interesting about collective impact that is distinct from collaboration is this notion of backbone support or backbone infrastructure, right? And so that's, saying, hey, we're not going to do this collaboration off the side of our desk. We're actually going to put it in the middle of at least somebody's desk, right? This backbone infrastructure desk. And that group is going to be facilitating, coordinating, building this kind of movement for change. And so that's the framework of collective impact. It is more, it's more a set of principles than it is a recipe, right? So we know that collective impact does certain things and doesn't do certain things, right? So it's not a single organization or a single sector approach. So you can't really say, okay, so we work in the health sector, so we're going to do a collective impact initiative, but only health sector folks are going to be involved. That's not collective impact. That's collaboration within the health sector. And you can certainly use collective impact ideas or elements to build a common agenda and to use shared measurement. But collective impact is multi-sector, right? It's really bringing in, folks from different sectors so that you can tackle the true complexity of the problem. It doesn't focus only on programs. It really looks at programs and systems. And it's really more focused on a longer term horizon, right? It's hard to do collective impact work within a 1 year time frame. Although funders have requested that, sometimes it's hard. You can, make some progress, but you're not going to be able to do big population level change in 1 year. That usually takes a minimum of 3 to 5 years to achieve kind of population level change. And so those are the kind of things that you want to look at. And you also want to look at the systems barriers and the policy change opportunities in the work that you're trying to move forward. So that gives you a little bit about collective impact. What we're going to focus on now is some of the mindset shifts that are really important to really thinking about rolling out collective impact. And the first one is that one I just talked about, right? The focus on programs and systems. We know in our work that programs, and the next slide really kind of tells you this from the perspective of Karen Pittman. Programmatic interventions help people beat the odds. Systemic interventions help to change the odds, right? And so I love this quote from Karen because it says, in collective impact work, we've got to have a focus both on the programs because they're important, but often our partners in this collective impact work are delivering those programmatic interventions, and the collective impact table then has the luxury of saying, okay, across these programmatic interventions that the partners are delivering around this table, what are the systems barriers? What are the policy barriers? And how do we collectively seek to shift them? The next slide really kind of talks about this in a way that I love. So this comes out of some more work by John Kenya, uh, Mark Kramer, and Peter Senge, and it's called The Water of Systems Change. And so, what they've done, and what I really like about this, is they kind of say, okay, these are the elements that hold these complex problems in place. And if we're trying to work in a collective impact kind of way, we want to figure out what are the levers that we have to shift some of these elements, right? And so, they talk about structural levers, so policy, our internal practices as an organization, or even our practice about who's around the table. Do we bring in the voice of people with lived and living experience into the conversations that we have around change? And then what are the resource flows? What's that kind of financial and human resources, and can we shift them at all? Or do the funders that are investing in this say, yeah, we want to fund you for your collective work, but we're only going to fund one organization, right? So that becomes a bit of a barrier in this. So it is really thinking about, are these conditions that we have the ability to shift? Or do we have to do our work within these conditions? Or could we have different conversations with funders about how this work might be funded? The semi-explicit areas are around relationships and connections. So, who across the community has these relationships? Where are they strong? Where are they weak? Can we shift those relationships and those connections? And to what degree can we do that? And then I think the other thing, it's more semi-explicit, is how is power flowing in our community? And this is where it's so important to have folks with the lived and living experience around these collective impact tables, because they can tell the table, what is working for them and what's not working for them, and also how power questions come into play, and how power dynamics come into play. And then finally, mental models. And that's really where we get to transformative change. And a really good example of this is some of the work I did in the city of Hamilton, where we were trying to shift a community's mindset around being able to reduce poverty, right? And so we really had to get our community to believe that poverty was both a problem in the community, because they didn't want it, they knew it was a problem, but they didn't really want to talk about it. But then shift their model, their mental model, in such a way that said, hey, we can do something about this if we start to look at resource flows, if we start to look at policies and some of those practices. So this kind of 6 conditions of systems change, it's not each of them on their own. It's kind of looking at the interconnectedness of them, and to really think about, how the collective impact work can really move the levers in one way or another. So that's how this work is different. We're now going to pivot a little bit and show you a couple of examples of collective impact in action. Going to go through these relatively quickly, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So if you have a question about anything that I've talked about so far, or even about these examples that are coming up, please do put the questions into the chat box, and we'll leave about 10 minutes or so at the end of the webinar to kind of address some of the questions. So the first example is an initiative in Canada called the Halton Our Kids Network. And the thing about the Halton Our Kids Network, it's actually a network that is over 4 distinct municipalities. So it's a regional network. And so they recently released their collective impact report. They've been going for quite a while now. This is their 2019 report. They've been going for about 10 years now, and it's a really cool, you should visit their website. They have a cool, when you think about shared measurement and data collection, they have a data hub on their website. They have 7 ways that they are trying to work together, work collaboratively, so that all children thrive, all children and youth thrive across these 4 distinct communities and across the Halton region. And in their data hub, they are showing progress over time. And the progress in the seven areas are things like, our kids progressing through school effectively. What's the poverty rate in our community? What does this look like from a neighborhood perspective? But they're also every couple of years survey children and youth. So they survey children in grade 6, in grade 12, and they do a parental survey, and that all exists in their data hub. And so you can see kind of here, this is really their focus, right? They're going into a sharper focus in their work. In the next slide, what I really liked about the next slide is again their most recent report, and I picked out how they're talking about their progress, right? And so you can see that 27 neighborhoods have local data available to them, and that can be found in the data hub. That they've been able to build 1,000 relationships and connections across the our Kids network. That they have an amazing network of people creating action in Halton. They have 94 youth who participated in a survey to provide the town of Oakville, one of their 4 municipalities, with ideas for youth hangout spaces. So you can see this, and in their report, it goes into even more detail. But what I love about this is it's a really nice visualization of their collective achievements, really looking at different elements of their collective achievements. In the next example, this is an example called Expecting Justice. And it's a really neat one. I was just introduced to it a couple of weeks ago. So it's a Black-led collaborative. It's in California. And so they have a couple of really interesting things that they are doing in their Black-led collaborative. So what they're trying to work with is Black and Pacific Islander women who experience a disproportionate burden of preterm birth. So they've got 4 things that they are moving forward. But what's really interesting is the number 4 of this list. And this is where they are giving the women who are pregnant an extra $1,000 to $1,500 a month to support them through the pregnancy and into the first year of that baby's life and that family's life. And it's really interesting. They're learning a lot as they're going, but this is a nice kind of framing of both their common agenda and some of the key investment areas, some of the key mutually reinforcing activities that they're moving forward. And then the final example that I shared with you is just one I pulled from the web. I don't have a lot of information, but if we go to the next slide, Duncan, this is from, again, Sonoma County. I thought I would try to pull some examples for you that had some relevance. So they're using collective impact as well. You can see that there is this culture of drinking in Sonoma County. And so they really want to do things that will address this, right? And so they've got 3 core things that they're focused on: reducing risky alcohol use, preventing unintended pregnancies, and promoting responsible opioid use. And so you can see the measures that they put into place for their shared measurement, and you can see kind of the partners that they've brought around the table. In all 3 of these examples, what's really interesting is how they frame the common agenda, how they're showing who their partners are. If you were to dive into the other 2, you'd be able to see that, and also how they're framing their collective impact strategy. We would say this example from Sonoma County is a little bit like a plan on a page, and that's a tool that we have at Tamarack that we often share with our collective impact communities. Because if you can build a 1 slide, here's what we want to work on together, here's where our focus areas are, and here's how we're going to measure our success. It's a really great way of building connection for all of the partners that you have around the collective impact table. But it's also a really great way for you as a partner around the table to take it out to your partners and say, hey, we are, part of this initiative. We're, this organization, we're First Five. We are part of this Sonoma County initiative. We're working here. And this is what First Five is doing to contribute to our shared and collective success. So there you go. That's an overview of collective impact. We've talked about the preconditions. We've talked about the preconditions. We've also talked about the framework. We shared with you how we think collective impact is about both programmatic change and systems level change. And we gave you a couple of examples. So now what we're going to do is turn it over to you in terms of some of the questions you might have. And so, Duncan, I don't know if there's very many questions in the question box, but bring them on.
Yeah, we got questions, and if you haven't shared your question yet, feel free to add it to the Q&A panel or just the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to it. Our first question comes from Leslie, and they ask, how can we encourage funders to support backbone or collective impact work? In our community, funders are encouraging us to do systems change, but they tend not to actually fund it.
Hey, that's a really good question, Leslie. There are some really good resources out there where backbone or where funders have written about their backbone investments or their collective impact investments and the lessons that they've learned along the journey. One recent one that I thought was excellent came from the Palm Health Foundation. And they, to give you a bit of background around Palm Health, they've invested in 6 neighborhoods in Palm Beach County in the United States. And what they were doing was asking those neighborhoods to build neighborhood developed collective impact initiatives around 3 areas. One was around behavioral health, mental health and well-being. One was around caregiver supports. And the third was around diabetes prevention. And each of the neighborhoods in the 6 neighborhood framework, the neighborhoods could decide which of those 3 priorities they wanted to focus on as a neighborhood. Palm Health has supported this investment over 5 years, and they did a big evaluation recently about what they've learned. And so one of the resources that we'll share with you in the post email is that report. And what I would do if I was trying to make the case to a funder, I would say, hey, have you read this report? And try to make the connection to another funder who's investing in collective impact. And so really thinking about, who's out there, who's investing effectively in collective impact, who might have a relationship that is similar. So health to health, or, is there another government to government kind of funder? Can we identify those? And then start to look at what reports they've put out there and start to build the case that way. And there's lots of good examples on the web. You just have to kind of seek them out. We also at Tamarack on our website try to promote some of those reports as well. So there was a case study done about Palm Beach County, and also we did a webinar with Abby Goodman from Palm Health Foundation talking about the lessons that they've learned in their work. So, there's lots of sources that we can point you to at Tamarack as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Liz. Our next question comes from Kirsten, and they ask, can you start as a collaboration just using the collective impact attributes with the end game being a move to an authentic collective impact model?
Great question, Kirsten. I would say yes, absolutely. Or you don't ever have to move fully to collective impact if that's something that, isn't in your plans. I always think that the elements of the framework are good in and of themselves, right? The building of a common or shared agenda. It makes sense for every collaborative to sit around a table and say, hey, what is the heck we're working on together, right? That's a really good conversation to have. Shared measurement, always really important, right? And using data, if you're working on an issue together, if we're trying to work on pregnant and parenting teens, how many teens in our community are pregnant and parenting? And so knowing that helps frame the types of interventions that you might be working on collectively together. So again, I think shared measurement is a good one. I think independently you can use them, but you can also use them all together or pick 2 or 3. If you're only doing 2 or 3, you wouldn't want to call that collective impact, although there are examples of that in the wider collective impact world. I do think, collective impact is about multi-sector roundtables where the people with the lived and living experience are around those tables, because they bring the equity lens to the work and the urgency to the work as well. When you're dealing with an issue like poverty, people who are having the lived experience of poverty bring real urgency to the conversation. So I think that those are important. And then the five conditions are the critical kind of elements of collective impact work.
Wonderful. We have one last question that came from an anonymous attendee. It involves taking advantage, or here, I'll read it just verbatim. How do you take advantage of the attention of champions in the community who happen to severely disagree with how to take that next step? So I guess, how do you capture that energy, even though it seems rather oppositional?
Yeah. Really good question as well. I think what I would do if there were people in the community, I was trying to move the needle on poverty, and there were people in the community who said, well, if those people just got a job, we'd be able to figure it out. That's where data can be very helpful, right? Because sometimes they have an assumption about what the situation is in the community, but it isn't actually founded in data or grounded in data. So a good example of that is in Hamilton, the work that I did prior to joining Tamarack. People would say, if people living in poverty just got a job, they would no longer be in poverty. But when we started to disaggregate the data, what we saw was that 26% of the people living in poverty were seniors. So they had already completed their work life, right? Another 27% of the folks were people that were working full and part-time jobs, but just weren't earning enough to pull them over the poverty line. Another percentage, 26%, I think, were children. And so we have labor laws in Canada that say that children can't work, right? And so by the time we disaggregated the data, the actual number of people that if they only got a job was actually not that big a percentage of the 100%. And when you started to look at the if they only got a job part of the equation, what we found was that Hamilton wasn't very good at creating entry level jobs. So even if they were willing and able and had the education and the training, the number of opportunities in the community didn't match the number of people that were looking for those kinds of opportunities. And so data can be really helpful in kind of trying to make a case that is based in reality. The other thing that I would do is, because maybe that person does have their own data that they feel is very strong, I want to kind of listen to what their objections are, and then think about, what are they saying in terms of this work? Because they clearly have energy for this work, but they have a certain perspective or a certain interest that is related to to them not joining the table in a kind of positive way. And I might want to kind of take them out for coffee when we can do that, or have a deeper conversation with them about, well, what is it about that perspective or that interest that creates the barrier for me, and what do I, if I'm trying to do this collective work, what do I need to pay attention to? Because it's likely that that's not the only person in your community that holds that view, right? So sometimes those people that are challenging us with, their perspectives or their interests represent a bigger group, and for us to be able to say, hey, no, we really think this is the right way to go, listening to that enables us to to build the case for moving in a way that is a bit of a different direction. The other thing that you could do is, if that person says, this reason, then you can say, oh, but did you know about these things that are happening in the community? So you can, really think about what the counter case might be.
That's wonderful. That question spurred a further question, which I think is really interesting. So related, do you have any suggestions for managing power differentials For example, when one organization or sector has the wherewithal to drive initiatives because they have the power or the resources or influence.
Yeah. That's, these things are working collectively. We do a whole workshop on turf, trust, and collective impact. So we talk about turf and trust are power related, right? How we build trust, how we kind of deal with issues of turf are things that are connected into power. Power is an area actually at Tamarack that I want to dive into in some of my research and collaborative leadership kind of work. So watch Tamarack because we're going to have a few articles coming forward over the course of this year. But it is really interesting, right? Because there are always power dynamics at play in a community. And we found something really interesting when we were working on poverty in the city of Hamilton. So we had four sectors. We had 40 people around our collective impact table. 10 were people with lived experience, 10 were from community organizations, 10 were government leaders, and 10 were business community leaders, right? We really wanted to shift the conversation in our community about poverty. What's interesting about that makeup was the business and the people with the lived experience kind of lined up together and they created urgency. They wanted to get to quick solutions. Government and nonprofit organizations felt really good with process, right? They were really comfortable with, talking about the issue, trying to figure out, what the right solutions might be. And so that kind of dynamic tension that was created in the around the round table in Hamilton really created this momentum for us to move forward. And so, power can be used in a way that creates tension, and that tension can create some of that urgency, so you need to act, right? So that you're not endlessly talking about a problem, which is sometimes what we see around collaborative tables, is that they like dissect the problem to such a degree that they never get to action, and then the table starts to dissipate. So that's kind of interesting and I think useful. And you really want to kind of consider that. The other thing that is really important around power is to really think about, okay, so how do we set up the way that we meet together, the way that we make decisions together, that kind of what are the values and principles that we will hold on together as a collective group that will help us kind of navigate some of these tensions, right? And so, we suggest at Tamarack that it's a really important thing to do early on in your collective impact is to set up some of these values and principles and then revisit them or have someone around the table be the holder of them, right? And so when, someone acts in a way that actually breaks apart the values and principles or creates some of those power dynamics, that you can say, hey, we all signed on to these are the ones that we agreed to together, so let's figure out how we can live how we can act within the spirit of these values and principles. And I know we're just going out over time, but I'll tell you one quick story. So one value that we had at the round table was that we were a no blame, all accountable table, right? So that meant that you didn't blame anybody else sitting around the table, but you asked really tough questions. And that was a nice way of kind of addressing some of those power dynamics. So you can build that into your how you want to work together as a collaborative. Hey, Duncan, I think we're at the end of our time. So thanks everybody for joining us. Sign up for the next webinar in this series if you haven't signed up. And in a couple of days, you'll be hearing from us. So thanks everybody.